In the year 218 before the Common Era, a dark shadow began to loom over the Roman Republic, heralding an era of unprecedented blood and fire. This was not just the movement of an army, but the manifestation of one man's singular will, the legendary Carthaginian commander, Hannibal Barca. Driven by an ancient blood oath sworn in his youth, he prepared to undertake a journey that Rome believed was physically impossible for any mortal man. Before his father, Hamilcar, the boy swore eternal hatred against the Romans, a promise that would eventually bring an empire to its very knees. He was a master of the mind as much as the sword, a tactician whose genius remains unmatched in the long, bloody annals of human warfare. With the sparks of war ignited in Saguntum, Hannibal turned his eyes toward the heart of his enemy, while ready to strike where they felt most secure. He gathered a diverse host of mercenaries from across Africa and Iberia, uniting them under a single purpose: the absolute humiliation of the Roman state. The drums of war began to beat, echoing from the coast of Spain to the marble halls of the Senate, signaling the start of the nightmare. To bypass the Roman navy, Hannibal made a daring gamble. He would lead his army through the treacherous, sky-reaching peaks of the freezing Alpine mountains. Crossing the Rhone was only the beginning. Ahead lay a wall of rock and ice that had never been conquered by a major invading military force. Hannibal defied nature itself. He pushed his men upward into the clouds, where the air was thin and the cold was a deadly, silent enemy. Every step was a battle for survival. Men and animals plummeted into deep ravines as the narrow paths crumbled beneath the weight of the war elephants. The Alpine tribes harassed them from above, raining down rocks and arrows, turning the mountain passes into a vertical slaughterhouse for the struggling Carthaginians. Hannibal's leadership was the only thing holding the army together. He shared their hunger and their cold, promising them the riches of the Italian plains. The price of this audacity was staggering. Thousands died not from the sword, but from the brutal elements and the sheer exhaustion of the climb. After 15 grueling days, the survivors finally looked down upon the fertile lands of Italy. The impossible had been achieved. The ghost was at the door. More than half of his army was lost to the mountains. Yet, the remaining 26,000 men were now the most hardened veterans in the world. When Rome finally received word that Hannibal had crossed the Alps, the Senate was paralyzed by a mixture of disbelief and sudden visceral terror. The game had changed forever. Hannibal had brought the war to Rome's backyard, and he was ready to set the entire peninsula on fire. At the Trebia River, Hannibal proved he was a master of psychological warfare. He lured the Romans across the freezing water before they had eaten. Exhausted and numb, the Roman legions found themselves facing a well-rested Carthaginian force that had been warming themselves by campfires all morning long. Hannibal's brother, Mago, struck from ambush. The Roman lines crumbled under the surprise assault, turning the riverbanks into a scene of utter carnage. This was the first great lesson Hannibal taught the Republic. Numbers mean nothing if the commander does not understand the terrain or the enemy. A year later, at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal orchestrated the largest and most successful ambush in military history, utilizing the natural landscape as a weapon. The Roman consul, Flaminius, marched his men into a trap. He could not see the death that was waiting for him in the heavy morning mist. Without warning, half the hills came alive. Hannibal's men fell upon the Romans from three sides, leaving them no room to form their defensive squares. It was a massacre. Within hours, 15,000 Romans were dead, many drowned while trying to escape the relentless Carthaginian blades in the lake. Rome was in shock. Two armies had been destroyed, and the Ghost of Carthage was now moving freely through the heart of Italy. He didn't just defeat their soldiers, he dismantled their sense of security, proving that the Roman legions were not invincible on their own soil. But the greatest test was yet to come. On the dusty plains of Cannae, Hannibal would create his ultimate masterpiece of military destruction. In 216 BC, Rome gathered the largest army it had ever fielded, determined to crush the Carthaginian threat once and for all with overwhelming force. 80,000 Romans faced barely 40,000 Carthaginians. The sheer weight of the Roman infantry seemed enough to sweep Hannibal off the map. So Hannibal deployed his troops in a unique crescent shape, with his weakest infantry in the center and his elite African veterans on the wings. He knew the Romans would attack the center, and he planned to use their own aggression and momentum as a trap to destroy them. As the trumpets sounded, the Roman juggernaut surged forward, a wall of bronze and wood intended to pierce through Hannibal's center like a spear. Hannibal's center intentionally retreated step by step. The Romans, sensing victory, pushed harder and deeper, inadvertently cramming themselves into a tightening pocket. They were winning the center, but in doing so, they were losing their ability to maneuver, packed so tightly they could barely swing their swords. On the flanks, Hannibal's superior cavalry obliterated the Roman horsemen, chasing them from the field and leaving the Roman infantry completely exposed from behind. The trap was sprung. The elite African infantry, who had remained fresh, now turned inward, just striking the Roman flanks with devastating synchronized precision. Then came the final blow. Hannibal's cavalry returned, slamming into the Roman rear. The encirclement was complete. The hunters had become the prey. This was the double envelopment, a tactical maneuver so perfect it is still studied in every military academy across the modern world today. For the Romans, the battle became a slow-motion execution. There was no room to fight, no room to breathe, and absolutely no way to escape. For hours, the Carthaginians killed until their arms grew weary. It was a systematic slaughter of the finest youth Rome had to offer. By sunset, the Roman army had ceased to exist. Their commanders were dead, their eagles captured, and their pride buried in the earth. Hannibal had achieved the impossible. With a smaller army, he had surrounded and annihilated a force nearly double his own size. The estimates suggest that between 50 and 70,000 Romans died that day. It remains one of the bloodiest single days of combat in history. The sheer number of noble deaths was staggering. Hannibal sent bushels of gold rings back to Carthage as proof of his total and absolute victory. When the news reached Rome, the city descended into a state of pure hysteria. They believed the end of their civilization was at hand. The gates were barred, and human sacrifices were reportedly made to appease the gods. Rome was a city waiting for its final, inevitable executioner. But Hannibal did not march on the city. He lacked the siege equipment and the manpower to take a fortified metropolis of such immense size. Hannibal famously told him, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." The opportunity passed. Hannibal spent years roaming the Italian countryside, hoping Rome's allies would desert them. But the Roman Confederation proved surprisingly resilient despite the crushing defeats. And from the ashes of Cannae, a new kind of Roman leader emerged. Scipio Africanus had survived the slaughter and learned Hannibal's secrets by heart. Scipio realized that to defeat Hannibal, he had to stop fighting him in Italy. He took the war to Spain, cutting off Hannibal's reinforcements. Finally, Scipio launched a bold invasion of Carthage itself. The Roman strategy had shifted from defense to a daring, high-stakes offensive on African soil. After 15 years of undefeated campaigning in Italy, Hannibal was forced to abandon his conquest to return home and protect his native city. He left the land he had terrorized for over a decade, having won every battle but ultimately failing to win the war of attrition. At the Battle of Zama, the two greatest commanders of the age finally met face to face. It was the climax of the Second Punic War. Scipio used Hannibal's own tricks against him, and he neutralized the elephants and used his superior cavalry to strike the Carthaginian rear in a tragic irony. For the first time in his life, Hannibal was defeated. Carthage was forced to accept a humiliating peace, ending its status as a great power. He tried to rebuild his city through political reform, but his enemies and the vengeful Romans soon forced him into a life of lonely exile. Even in exile, he remained a ghost that haunted Rome. They never stopped hunting him, terrified that he might one day lead another army against them. In 183 BC, surrounded by Roman assassins in Bithynia, Hannibal chose to take his own life rather than be paraded through the streets of Rome. His last words were a final sting to his enemies. "Let us ease the Romans of their continual dread and care, who think it long to wait for the death of an old man." Carthage was eventually destroyed, but the name of Hannibal Barca was etched into the stones of history, becoming a symbol of tactical perfection. Or his ghost lived on in the minds of every great general who followed. Napoleon called him the greatest tactician of all time, a master of destruction. Even today, his maneuvers are taught as the gold standard of warfare, a testament to a mind that could see through the chaos of battle. Ironically, by nearly destroying Rome, Hannibal forced the Republic to become the hardened, professional empire that would eventually conquer the known world. He was the greatest enemy Rome ever faced, a man who transformed a personal oath of vengeance into a legendary saga of genius and tragedy. Hannibal Barca remains the ghost of Carthage, a reminder that even the mightiest empires can be brought to the brink by the will of one man. The snows of the Alps have long since melted and the blood at Cannae has washed away, but the legend of his daring march remains eternal. His life was a storm that reshaped the Mediterranean, and a flash of brilliance that illuminated the darkest corners of the ancient world's art of war. Though he lost his city and his life, he won immortality. No study of history is complete without the name of the man who dared the impossible. He was the nightmare that taught Rome fear, the fire that tempered an empire, and the architect of a masterpiece that will never be forgotten. Remember the name Hannibal Barca, For in the shadows of every great victory, his tactical ghost still watches, waiting for the next master of war.